All right. Well, welcome everyone. I am Jeremy Rogers, the General Counsel and Government Affairs Director at Oregon Realtors, and greatly appreciate you being here today and want to share with you the latest information regarding FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program and Endangered Species Act plan for Oregon. Um, and we're holding this particularly at this time because FEMA has issued a draft environmental impact statement on the plan, which discusses the impacts of their proposed plan to the human and natural environment. And by law, FEMA is required to accept public comment on the plan and the EIS, and those comments are due by October 6th. And so we're hoping with the meeting today that we can help you better understand the plan and the impacts that FEMA has analyzed, and prepare you both to submit comments and also to share with your colleagues, with your clients, and with other folks in the business community as well, about this so that they are aware and are able to make comments as well. I'm going to go through this. I'm going to go through slides, but we have set this up as a meeting where folks can chime in. So if you do have questions, feel free to ask them, um, and we'll go ahead and get started. So just a little background on the National Flood Insurance Program, as you are all mostly aware, I assume. The NFIP is a program that's been around since the 1960s. The goal is to protect lives and property, to reduce costs to taxpayers of flooding events, and over 22,000 communities across the nation participate, including about 250 communities in Oregon. The NFIP is administered by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and the program includes mapping floodplains, establishing minimum floodplain management standards that FEMA has set out in administrative rule that if communities adopt, then those communities and their property owners are eligible for flood insurance under the NFIP. The actual flood insurance coverage, um, and then access to federal financial assistance should disaster occur for folks who have insurance. Um, the communities involved in the NFIP, the counties and the cities play an important role. They adopt those local floodplain management ordinances based on those standards set by FEMA. Um, they issue or deny floodplain development permits for proposed developments in the floodplain. And some communities uh, establish higher standards than what FEMA has set as part of what's called the community rating system. And that gets them even further discounts on flood insurance premiums for their constituents. For your purposes, of course, one of the most important things is that homes and businesses that are in the floodplain with mortgages that are backed by the federal government are required to have flood insurance. And the primary way that folks get flood insurance is through the NFIP. Private options outside of the NFIP are quite limited, and in some places don't really exist, but where they do exist are quite limited. So uh, what we're talking about today all started with a lawsuit back in 2009 from various environmental groups, that alleged that FEMA had failed to consult with the National Marine Fisheries Service, another federal agency, regarding the impacts of implementing the National Flood Insurance Program in Oregon on 15 threatened and endangered species. You can see a little clip from their original complaint there listing all the species, primarily salmon and steelhead, although ultimately this was expanded to cover the southern resident killer whale as well. So that was brought in 2009. FEMA settled that lawsuit and said, okay, we will consult with the National Marine Fisheries Service. Now, how this works as part of the Endangered Species Act is that under Section 7, they call it a Section 7 consultation, any federal agency um, is required to ensure that the actions that they authorize, fund, or carry out are unlikely to jeopardize the continued existence of any endangered or threatened species or result in the destruction or adverse modification of their habitat. So this is what the Audubon Society and other environmental groups were claiming FEMA had not done. And FEMA settled that lawsuit and said, okay, we will do this. So they did that consultation with the National Marine Fisheries Service, which is part of NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And that consultation, essentially, where um, the National Marine Fisheries Service under NOAA sort of does their analysis and evaluation of the program's impact on species, and that they issue what's called a biological opinion. And that biological opinion found that the implementation of the NFIP in Oregon, the continued implementation, was likely to jeopardize 16 endangered species, uh, adversely modify critical habitat of those species, and have adverse effects on essential fish habitat. They, in that biological opinion, presented what is called reasonable and prudent alternatives. These are recommendations that the National Marine Fisheries Service lays out for how to modify the program to come in compliance with the Endangered Species Act. The essence of that was that uh, NIMS told FEMA that they needed to modify the NFIP in Oregon to ensure what they called no net loss of key habitat functions. We'll talk about what that means here in a minute. Essentially, though, that any adverse impacts to habitat must either be avoided or offset through mitigation to ensure no change in habitat function. So one thing that's important to recognize about this issue is that what we're talking about here, this lawsuit, this consultation, this biological opinion is specific to Oregon. It is not nationwide. These are not nationwide rules. This is about FEMA's implementation of the NFIP in Oregon with respect to specific species that inhabit the waters of Oregon. So here's what that means in a little more detail in terms of no net loss. So what they identified was basically three floodplain functions. One which they call flood storage. Um, and so this is essentially where do the waters go when it floods? And any structure or other thing residing in the floodplain is essentially reducing the amount of flood storage. Um, and what they said was, well, that means that fish do not have, when it floods, fish do not have habitat to access and then to egress to get back out to the river when the floodwaters reside. The second function was water quality. Um, so the proxy for water quality, like how do they measure whether water quality is being impacted, was that they used was pervious surfaces, those surfaces that don't allow water to seep through, uh, saying that any pervious surfaces in the floodplain mean that you're not receiving that natural filtration of water, which is going to impact, create pollutants that go into the water. It's going to raise the temperature of the water, and it's going to impact the flow of the water. And then finally, vegetation. And they looked at this with looking at trees that are 6 inches in diameter at breast height or greater, saying that those trees provide a canopy for water that creates and habitat that creates shade and filtration, creates woody debris, and that stabilizes the soils and the ground around the rivers and the floodplain. So these were the things that NIMS was concerned about and said that FEMA's implementation of the flood insurance program was impacting and causing negative impacts on species and habitat, and that would need to be fully mitigated um, for the program to continue in a way that does not violate the Endangered Species Act. So the communities that are affected by this are all areas that are covered by the National Flood Insurance Program and that have the presence of any of these species. And you'll see the map here. It shows the area. It's most of Oregon, and really all but about 5 or 6 counties are impacted. And if you look at the 250 or so communities that participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, about 90% of them are impacted by this. So a little timeline of sort of what happened after this biological opinion to get us to today, and then we can start talking about the details of this particular plan and the impacts, and then what we can try to do about it. So back in 2017, Oregon Realtors, Oregon Home Builders, the Oregon Farm Bureau, uh, Tillamook County, and several other private and public entities formed a group called Oregonians for Floodplain Protection. Um, it's a 501(c)(4) organization. We formed it for the primary purpose of uh, litigating against this biological opinion and advocating against a biological opinion. Um, a lawsuit was filed back in 2017 by Oregonians for Floodplain Protection, though it was just, and it claimed, a series of claims, including that the biological opinion was flawed, is based on inaccurate information and data, that FEMA didn't have the authority and statute or regulation to do what it was doing. Um, if it were going to do anything like that, it would have to go through public notice and comment rulemaking, and a variety of other claims. They were dismissed at that time because at that time FEMA did not have a plan. They were only told through this biological opinion that they needed to do this, but they had not yet developed a plan. And the judge says, when there's a plan that they're actually threatening to implement that creates imminent harm, then you can come back with your lawsuit. So in 2018, Representative DeFazio, who is no longer in Congress, but was at the time representing Eugene, Southern Willamette Valley, and out to the coast there, secured a 3-year delay in the implementation of this plan. Meanwhile, FEMA started actually developing a draft plan, and they issued a draft plan in 2021. In 2023, they began review under the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, which is what has led to the draft environmental impact statement that we'll talk about today. Also in 2023, environmental groups, some of the same ones that originally sued and others, sued FEMA for moving too slowly, saying, hey, this biological opinion was issued in 2016. We're now at 2023. You have not implemented it yet, and you're continuing to violate the Endangered Species Act. Largely in response to that lawsuit, FEMA announced in 2024 what they called pre-implementation compliance measures, or PICMs, which were designed to be temporary measures to get through until their final plan had gone through the NEPA process and was adopted. Those PICMs told cities and counties by December of last year that they had to pick a PICM, and the 3 PICMs they could pick from were: 1, halting all development in floodplains; 2, adopting a model ordinance, which at the time hadn't even been developed, but has since been developed; or 3, that they would have to ensure compliance on a permit by permit level. And so any permit applicant for development in the floodplain would have to do a habitat assessment to demonstrate how their particular project avoided and mitigated any impacts to the threatened and endangered species. In 2025, at January of this year, Oregonians for Floodplain Protection brought back our lawsuit and an updated version because FEMA had now implemented these PICMs and was moving forward with their long-term plan. And uh, then FEMA in August of this year, last month, issued an update to their draft plan and the draft environmental impact statement, which we'll talk about today. Um, the status of those lawsuits is that both are still pending. They're both in front of Judge Simon here in the Federal District Court in Oregon. Um, Ours, as I mentioned, was brought by Oregonians for Floodplain Protection, National Home Builders, and Oregon Home Builders also named plaintiffs on that case. And that is against FEMA and the National Marine Fisheries Service. In addition to challenging the BIOP and FEMA's authority to implement it, we filed a motion for a preliminary injunction to halt any further action to carry out their plan. Um, And with the status of that is that the case is currently stayed until October 31st for Oregonians for Floodplain Protection, our group, and FEMA and NIMS to discuss potential settlement. Um, so that's ongoing. And at this point, I don't think there's much more we can say. While that would be, potentially a good outcome if we could reach settlement. Um, I think it's, uh, I would not be relying on that. That I would not be relying on this going away through a settlement. Um, I think that's very unclear at this point whether that would come together. The other lawsuit for the environmental groups also still pending. There were briefs motions for summary judgment on that, but the court held off on issuing a ruling to give FEMA more time to um, continue with its environmental impact statement and also to sort of see what happens with this whole settlement conversation in the other lawsuit. So both of these are ongoing with no resolution and really unclear where they ultimately will end up. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about the details of this and how it could impact you, your clients, your community, and just want to sort of level set about who is impacted. So this is going to impact any development in the 100-year floodplain they call the special flood hazard area. And so development includes, it's very broad, any man-made change to the improved or unimproved environment. And that includes buildings of any size, any structures, including terraces and fences, mining, dredging, filling, grading, excavating, drilling, any sort of paving, including roads, driveways, and sidewalks. It also includes the long-term storage of equipment and materials. So even if things are not necessarily affixed to the ground, if they are being stored for more than 6 months, and taking up flood storage by being in the floodplain, it would be impacted by this. Um, and then also environmental work, bank stabilization or habitat restoration, as well as public utility work, and port, pier, marina related work, as well as any underground tanks. So a few terms here as we get into the details. So we're talking about the floodplain or sorry for the typo there, special flood hazard area, SFHA. We're talking about the areas that FEMA has mapped that are subject to flooding during an event that has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. These are the areas where you or your clients, would be required to have flood insurance for a mortgage. This is the primary, what we mean when we say the floodplain. We'll also talk a little bit about the floodway. This is the more immediate channel of a river and immediately adjacent areas to that channel. There's a new term that FEMA has now introduced for these particular rules that they're proposing, and that is the riparian buffer zone or RBZ. And this is 170 feet inland from the ordinary high water mark of a waterway. And that area from the water to 170 feet out, there are even stricter restrictions as part of their plan. And then they also talk about the reach of a waterway, and that's a section of the stream or river along which similar hydrologic conditions exist. I'm going through these terms because I'm going to show you what's required, and they use these terms to differentiate. So this is just a little image to show you what this riparian buffer zone looks like. So this area here in the middle is the channel. You imagine the area just right above the ordinary high water mark, being the floodway area. But now you have this 170-foot inland area, which is the riparian buffer zone, where these special additional requirements are going to apply. So let's talk a little bit now about the actual plan that FEMA has now updated on paper and that they've looked at the impacts of. And this shows what what they would be asking of anyone doing development in the floodplain. So um, if the location of the impact is this is for flood storage capacity. So this is any structures that are being built, equipment that's being stored, anything that's taking up space that otherwise would allow water to go when it floods. So if that development is occurring in the floodway, then it would have to be mitigated at a ratio of 2 to 1. So when we talk about these ratios, that means however much cubic space you're taking up with that structure, if you were to mitigate that exactly, it would be 1 for 1. If you would have to mitigate twice as much, it's 2 for 1. And what that means is removing an equivalent amount of soil from the floodplain. So if you build a structure and it takes up a certain amount of space, if you have to mitigate 2 for 1, you have to remove twice that amount of soil from the floodplain to create space where that water can then go that you've taken up with the development. If it's in the riparian buffer zone, also 2 to 1 ratio. If it's in the flood plain, but not in the floodway or the riparian buffer zone, 1.5 to 1. Then, depending on where your mitigation happens, because your mitigation may or may not be able to happen on site, and FEMA has found in most cases it probably won't be able to happen on site because the amount of land required would mean you'd actually need a second parcel of land to do the mitigation. So if the mitigation occurs on site or off site, but within the same reach of the river, then it's 100%. So it's these ratios that you see up here, 2 to 1, 2 to 1, 1.5 to 1. If that mitigation is occurring offsite in a different reach of the river, then it's twice as much as that. So it'd be 4 to 1, 4 to 1, and 3 to 1. Okay. So that's for flood storage. This is now um, for trees that are removed. So these are trees 6 inches diameter at breast height or larger that are removed. So if those are removed from the floodway, you can see how many trees you need to replace based on the size of the trees. So this table shows 6 inches to 20 inch is 20 inch to 39 inch, greater than 39 inch. So you can see a minimum 3 to 1 replacement up to 6 to 1 replacement. And then inside the riparian buffer zone, similar. And then in the floodplain, but not in the floodway or the riparian buffer zone, 2 to 1 to 5 to 1. Similarly, if you look down here at the bottom, you would multiply that though if you're replanting those trees in a different reach of the river. You'd have to multiply those numbers by 2. So that would lead the largest trees would have to be replaced at a ratio of 12 to 1 in the floodway and the riparian buffer zone, or 10 to 1 in the remainder of the flood hazard area. I meant to have an additional slide. Oh, yeah. This is pervious surface. And I see there's a question. I'll take that here in a second. So this is like paving a driveway, paving a road, paving a sidewalk. 1 to 1 mitigation in all three of the areas, but you would multiply that by 2 if that mitigation happened outside of the same reach of the river. Hey, Kelly, did you have a question?
Yes, sir. Thank you. I'm a little curious. If you're taking out large trees and you've got to replace them 6 to 1 or whatever ratio it is, how do you replace a 30 diameter, a tree that maybe is 50 years old, and replace it with like trees? Are you saying you just have to plant seedlings 6 to 1? How would you replace 6 big trees that take 50 years to grow? How do you
Yeah. The requirement now, I think there are some requirements around like native species and things like this, but the the requirement would be you're planting the seedlings. You're not required to have a tree of the same size.
Well, that's what I'm saying. It would be
Yeah,
impossible.
it'll
So,
grow to yeah. So, but there are some requirements about native species and such, and I don't have
okay.
those right in front of me. Yeah,
All right. Thank you.
yeah. Okay, so they did examples in the draft environmental impact statement. They looked at examples. Um, oh, I see a couple more hands raised, so let's do those. Pam, did you have a question? Oh, Pam, did you have a question?
Mute. Okay, thank you. Yes, so with regard to building a structure in the floodway, um, what if the structure is like up on piling so water can still flow underneath it?
Yeah, so if your structure is up on pilings, then to the degree that the structure is above the floodplain, so that you're out of the floodplain, then at that point, for the structure, you'd be mitigating the lost flood storage of the pilings, but not of the rest of the structure. So, so for homes, that is, something that obviously people would be looking at. Of course, there's the added expense of trying to constructing the homes on pilings. Um, and then, of course, for other areas where, commercial development or downtown areas that you have that are in the floodplain, that might not be a realistic option for them. So, uh, so this is a model project, residential new build, single family home. And this is assumed to be in that riparian buffer zone area within 170 feet of the waterway. And in this instance, it's a 1,500 square foot home and a 20 by 40 foot driveway. And what their analysis found here was that you'd have to, 1,700 cubic feet of new fill and structure would be being added because of the house and the driveway. And that with those ratios that we talked about earlier, that would mean you'd have to remove 6,800 cubic feet of material from the floodplain to create space where fish can access and egress during flood events. So replacement flood storage. So essentially, unless you're removing an existing structure, what that would mean is like digging digging a hole and removing soil to create, of 6,800 cubic feet to create that replacement flood storage. As I mentioned, what they found when analyzing this is that would likely require a second parcel of land. In some cases, this might be able to be done on site, but in most cases, that it probably would not be able to. In terms of that pervious surface, that water quality impact, the 2,300 square feet of driveway would need to be mitigated with 4,600 square feet of impervious surface somewhere else. So that means like you would need to be unpaving um, and a 4,600 square feet of surface somewhere else in the floodplain.
Jeremy, we have another hand up.
Yep.
Brent.
Hey, Jeremy. Thank you very much for doing this. I
Yeah.
appreciate the update on it. How is this not a takings under the U.S. Constitution, the Fifth Amendment as a regulatory taking? How is this not a regulatory taking that the federal government's going to have to pay everybody for the costs involved?
Yeah, thanks, Brent. That's a great question. And I assume that they will be sued for that. Um, so I mean, I think it's a good question, and I hope they do get sued for it. Um, I think what they say to that is that the National Flood Insurance Program is a voluntary program, and so we are not forcing property owners to do this. We're creating the conditions that they must meet to be part of this voluntary program. Now, there's different case law out there about sort of when a condition becomes a requirement and when, the federal government is essentially using their force and power to, even though it's not technically a requirement because it's an optional program, it really is a requirement because you can't function without it. So I think those claims will be brought, and it'll be interesting to see how they play out. But that's what they say. They say it's a voluntary program. Um, was there another question?
Micah?
Yeah, I got two quick questions. One for the flood storage. Could you dig a hole and turn it into a pond as a water storage? And then for the driveway, could it be a gravel and not be considered impervious?
Yeah, so if so I believe like a gravel driveway would be would be pervious, right? That allows the water through. I mean, obviously designed properly to allow water through. Um, so that would so for example, if you didn't pave, if you didn't use impervious surface like cement or concrete or asphalt, or if you did and you found some other area, you did your mitigation and you turned an existing asphalt or concrete, uh, you know, driveway into a gravel, that could be your mitigation. Um, and then the storage, yeah. So a pond, yeah. I mean, essentially, yes, that would qualify. What the DEIS though doesn't really, and the plan doesn't really account for is like, are you allowed, are you going to be allowed to do the mitigation under other laws? Like other Oregon land use laws and removal fill laws, are you going to be able to just dig a giant pond where you need to in the floodplain to do this mitigation? I think that's sort of unanswered, sort of how this intersects with other requirements, including environmental restrictions and considerations. But yes, I think the idea would be you'd create a pond. Um, although that's a good question because you're filling the pond. If you're filling the pond with water immediately rather than just waiting for it to fill with a flood or something, that's a good question, and I'm gonna look into that a little bit further because I'm not sure exactly how they characterize that in their plan. The vegetation with this example, if you removed 5 trees that were greater than 6 inches, 30 trees must be planted. And then because this is in the riparian buffer zone, in addition to the mitigation requirements, there is what they call beneficial gain. You have to actually add back a little more. And so in this instance, 115 square feet of the riparian buffer zone must be planted with native riparian herbaceous shrub and or tree vegetation, in addition to the tree replacement requirements. The other thing is that all of this mitigation needs to be done at the same elevation in the floodplain, because that's, the impacts are happening relative to the elevation that you're at in the floodplain. So that's another sort of mystery here as to how that would be feasible. So this is just to help illustrate what this
Jeremy?
looks like. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So especially right now when we're having so many issues with insurance and having insurance wanting us to cut trees down. Um, so if you can't get insurance on your property and now you cut down one tree and you have to replace it with 5, I mean, I don't know how this works with that aspect of what we're trying to do here either for fire insurance.
Yeah, well, and that's a great question. And I'm going to flag that because we're going to talk a little bit later about comments. And one of the most valuable things you could do in comments, we're going to provide you some things like that we're talking about as an organization, but one of the most valuable things you could do would be like bring up additional things that people haven't thought of yet, or that, you're thinking about like, and this is a great one. It's like, here you're telling us that we have to plant these trees, but we're going to have other federal or state agencies telling us that we can't do that, or the impacts on our insurance and how that's going to play into the feasibility of this plan. Because ultimately, what we want FEMA to realize is this plan is not feasible, both technically and economically, and that it undermines the very purpose of the National Flood Insurance Program, which is to protect people and property, because they're going to be forcing people to do things that actually could harm people and property. And so, I don't know the answer to that, Jill, but that'd be like a great thing to bring up in the comments. And then they would have to address that in the final EIS. And as they make their decision, they would have to say, oh, well, someone brought up the insurance issue, and here's our response to that and why that, this plan still makes sense or doesn't.
Well, that's two different things, because if you have to have flood insurance to have a mortgage and you have to have insurance to have a mortgage, then now they're telling you it's not a mandatory thing, but it really is a mandatory thing. So I don't know how they got away with that.
Yep. Yep.
Mhm.
There's
No,
a
great,
few more things in chat as well.
great point. Okay. And I will get to those. I'm having trouble seeing the chat. Kelly, would you mind asking those?
Sure. Christelle asks, how will this be implemented with property that is also zoned F2? What policies are in charge?
Yeah, Jeremy, you kind of touched on that, so you can pass off because Jill, with her insurance question, my first thought is like, with the trees, who's the regulatory body? Just like with my background in timber, you can't just plant trees and then not do some mediation to get them to grow. I mean, that there's a whole bunch of state timber regulations that, the stewardship foresters are coming out with replanting. So
Yep. Yep.
yeah, like one requirement then creates another requirement. So you can just pass me on because I
Yeah,
think
no,
Jill
and that's
has full
great. And
touched
again,
on it.
yeah, and I think that's excellent. And I think, as the more things we can point out about how this conflicts with other requirements and has unintended impacts and really doesn't make sense because you can't do what they're asking, the more likely maybe then they'll be to try to change course. So this is just a visualization of like how much soil you'd have to. So an average dump truck carries 10 cubic yards of material. Assuming you're having to mitigate off-site, which would be the case in most instances, that would be 6,800 cubic feet of soil or 25 dump trucks of soil that would have to be removed from the special flood hazard area to mitigate for that 1,500 square foot home and driveway. And then what the plan and the EIS does not address either is where do you put that material? You have to take it from the floodplain. You can't put it in the floodplain, but you have to dispose of it somewhere. And then, of course, there's all sorts of legal and regulatory and land use and economic questions about where do you dispose it? Is there a lawful way to do that? How do you what are the costs of that disposal, et cetera? None of that is addressed. So communities will have a few options on how they implement it. So it's going to be these standards that I just went through, but there's some different ways to get at it. So on the left, we have the pick'ems. These are what's in place now, these temporary measures that I talked about, where it's a model ordinance, prohibit all development, or the permit by permit. The second approach, the long-term approach, this plan that the long-term plan that they've done the draft EIS on has 4 pathways. One is also a model ordinance, which would be similar to the one that folks have adopted now with some updates for the refinements they've made to the plan. The next would be a model ordinance checklist. So this would be a community that says, hey, we're not going to adopt your model ordinance word for word, but here's a combination of other ordinances we have that combined accomplish the same goal. The third is a customized community plan. So if the community, the city or the county could come up with something other than path A or B that would demonstrate that would also get to this no net loss, then that's a pathway. So it's unclear exactly how that would work and whether communities would be able to pull that off and come up with something, but that is one of the pathways. And then path D is what they call a habitat conservation plan or Section 4D plans. So these would be sort of separately negotiated plans where the community goes directly to the National Marine Fisheries Service and says, hey, we know that we have to have no net loss, a floodplain function. We don't like the FEMA ordinance and such. Let's directly negotiate a plan to conserve the species here and have a sort of direct plan. This is very rare and very difficult, and typically the standards are even higher than what you'd have to do under these others, and so it's unlikely that that pathway will be taken by any community. So let's talk a little bit about the NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act analysis, because that's what we're able to comment on right now. Under NEPA, agencies do what they call environmental impact statements on their plans and programs. If they're making doing a major federal action or change to their plan or program. This is a law. It applies to all federal agencies, and they have to consider a series of things of impacts on the human and natural environment, including land development and use, economic impacts, a variety of environmental impacts, cultural impacts, tribal treaty rights, and impacts on public and critical infrastructure. So that's what's sort of analyzed in this draft environmental impact statement. It also lays out, as all environmental impact statements do, a few alternatives. So alternative 1 is essentially the no action alternative. This would be the National Flood Insurance Program implemented as it was in 2023 prior to even the temporary measures. So this is the National Flood Insurance Program that we all knew and maybe loved, maybe didn't love, but we all were familiar with before these new requirements. Alternative 2 is what I described to you, these no net loss standards and the mitigation ratios required above, except with an exception, which is that if a project already has project-specific ES Endangered Species Act compliance, it would not then also have to meet the no net loss standard and the ratios. So for example, if a large project already had to get federal permits because it required like federal wetlands permits or Clean Water Act permits, then that project may already have had to go through Endangered Species Act compliance. And so it wouldn't have to double up here. So that would largely be for larger projects very near the water. Alternative 3 is the no net loss standard period. So no exceptions, including for projects that already have received ESA compliance. So they looked at the impacts in the draft environmental impact statement. This is like a high level summary. So S means a significant adverse impact. LS means an adverse impact, but less than significant. BE means beneficial effect, and NI means no impact. So you can see the no action alternative, which is alternative 1 compared to alternative 2 and alternative 3. And not surprisingly, alternative 2 and 3 were found to have significant adverse impacts on land development, use, and value, and on a variety of economic factors. And those included, housing development, commercial development, industrial development. A significant adverse impact on transportation, public and critical infrastructure, health, and safety. And you can see the little plus there in alternative 3, because there's no exception for projects that already received ESA compliance. There's even a little plus there on alternative 3 for those impacts. On the other hand, sorry. On the other hand, on the environmental dimensions, it found beneficial effects for most of the environmental considerations that it looked at, including water quality and floodplains, vegetation, and threatened endangered species, as well as tribal treaty rights. So beneficial effect on the alternative 2 and 3, and then adverse effects on alternative 1 related to those resources. So that's super high level. Here's some more kind of specific things that it found. Increased construction costs of 9.5% for on-site mitigation, to 28.8% for off-site mitigation. That would lead to increased mortgage costs for a home buyer purchasing that 1,500 square foot home of up to $7,500 a year, if that was the cost associated with that offsite mitigation. That mitigation would likely require a second parcel of land, which is not likely to align with Oregon's comprehensive plans, could conflict with zoning, and is likely to make the state's housing production goals more challenging. On transportation projects, including safety projects, it found that those projects could be significantly delayed or even abandoned altogether, some of those projects. And that also there'd be a significant cost to the jurisdictions to implement this just from a administrative capacity. Statewide, when you add up all the cities and counties, that they estimated that could be about 23 to 47 million dollars, and 100 to 200K a pop, which I think is probably a significant underestimate of what it would cost a local government to implement something this drastic. So let's talk about sort of comments and what we can do, and would love to hear from you too, your thoughts, your feedback on sort of our strategy here on comments and how to make the most impact, both in terms of what we're saying and getting more people to comment. So first, please snap this QR code on this website, floodplainprotection.org. That's our coalition website and can serve as a hub for you and for clients and others that you're sharing this information with. It has a link, a click to comment where you can submit comments to FEMA. Has a one-pager on there that sort of quickly describes what this is, what's required, what the impacts are. There's videos of folks that are impacted. You can share those. Links to all the social media channels. Please like and share. Really trying to get the word out so that Oregonians who are impacted by this are aware and they submit comments. So FEMA's taking oral and written comments. The final public meeting to do oral comments, and I've been to a few of these now. What FEMA does is they describe the plan similar to what I described, and then they have a court reporter there that takes public comment at the end. The last public meeting for comment is 6 to 8 p.m. on September 30th via Zoom. A link to that, to register for that, is on that Oregonians for Floodplain Protection website. Written comments are due by October 6th. And FEMA is required by law to summarize all the public comments received, provide a response to all substantive comments, and to document any changes that they make to the EIS as a result of the comments. And then they take that, they issue a final environmental impact statement and the choice of which alternative they're going with. And that would likely happen sometime around a year from now. So I think as you're thinking about comments to make, or that you and your clients and others in your community can make, talking about impacts that affect you personally and your profession as a real estate professional, your clients, and them, and your communities is really helpful. We'll talk about some high level things that you can say, but I think the more people that comment and bring some of their own story to the table of why they're concerned and are talking about how it impacts them, I think the better, so that everyone isn't just saying the same thing. Although more comments is better, but being specific to your concerns, I think is even better than just repeating the same thing. As far as some of those higher level comments that we're making, like Oregon Realtors and the organizations that we're working with, as we look at the factors that FEMA has to consider in public comment and making a decision about what alternative they choose, we want to be sure to tell them that alternative 1 is the preferred alternative, that alternatives 2 and 3 are not technically feasible. I have a document that kind of builds each of these out a little bit more that we'll drop in the chat. Kelly, that was that document I sent you. If you are able to drop a link to that in the chat, if you have it, that would be great.
Okay.
Because basically FEMA has to pick something that's technically feasible, meaning that it's actually implementable. And for a variety of reasons, this isn't. And Kelly will drop in the chat like a little bit more sort of argument under each of these points that we are sharing with folks as they think about creating their own comments. The alternatives 2 and 3 are not economically feasible. They have to pick an alternative where the costs like aren't greater than the benefits. And that clearly isn't the case here, particularly when you have a program that's supposed to be protecting people and property, yet they find that all of the negative impacts are to people and property, and the benefits only come to environmental concerns. Alternatives 2 and 3 aren't consistent with the program objectives of the NFIP, which is to protect people and property and issue flood insurance based on risk to people and property, as all of these requirements are not designed to protect people and property, designed to protect fish, and in many cases harm people and property by some of the comments we heard here, even making it more difficult to get other types of insurance, putting people in a position where they're not actually able to do what FEMA is asking, meaning they can't develop their property at all. Critical infrastructure being significantly impacted in an adverse way, and public road safety projects not being completed or being delayed, all sorts of things that actually just undermine the whole purpose of the NFIP. That these alternatives are not consistent with FEMA's statutory and regulatory authorities. Again, by statute, FEMA has to, this program is to protect people and property. And under regulation, they've already developed their floodplain development criteria that apply to every community in the country. And those are in regulation, and they went through public notice and comment rulemaking. And here they are trying to alter that just for Oregon without updating that regulation that went through years-long processes to be developed. And so, they're really, in our view, doing this outside of their authority. But also what's really important in comments, if you have this information, or if folks in your community have this information, are examples where the draft EIS fails to adequately describe or assess the impacts to your community, your organization, your constituents, your clients. So this is an opportunity to kind of look through the materials and say, hey, there's something they really didn't think about that I know affects me or my community, and I'm going to tell them about that, because then they have to take that into account. Um, um, and additional information that you have. If you have information or data that you think that they should take a look at as they're assessing the impacts of this on the economy or on housing prices, or one thing, like, for example, I don't think they even took into account, when they looked at the economic impacts, the impact on people who sell real estate. Well, if it's going to be a negative impact on the ability to develop real estate, it's going to be a negative impact on the people to sell real estate. Well, they didn't really look at that. So I think firing at them all the things that they didn't consider, and any information for them to consider, will force them to take a look at that. Other critical ways to help at this juncture: encouraging your clients, your colleagues, and other members of your community and other organizations you're involved in to submit comments and to attend FEMA's public meeting. To like, share, and engage with all the social media content. We really hope that folks who aren't in organizations like ours and aren't getting these types of briefings can still hear about this through channels like social media. And again, we've created some videos and other shareable content. If you do have compelling examples or stories about how this impacts you, your community, your clients, your business, let us know, because if that's a story that you're willing to share, or that you'd like us to share, we are trying to capture those things so we can tell compelling stories that will get people to pay attention. And also, we could incorporate some of those things into our own comments from Oregon Realtors as well. And then for local associations, for local association leaders, please connect with me and we can coordinate on organizational comments. We're putting together a very detailed Oregon Realtors comment letter. But let's coordinate, because maybe we decide that we work together so that each local also submits a comment letter with some more localized comments and impacts, so that we can get more letters in and more localized information. Or we want to at least incorporate that into our letter. So please connect with me after this and let's coordinate on that. Again, the place to send people and for you to get more information that you need is the website at floodplainprotection.org.
Couple of hands raised.
And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and let's just talk, and would love, yeah, questions and feedback as well, or thoughts about how we can be most effective together with our comments. Dave, go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
So I have a situation with one of my former clients. Actually, they're a client that bought up the McKenzie River, started developing the property, has been going on for a while now. All of a sudden, the county is using this future action as a means to stop them from further development, i.e. not permitting different things like doing some mitigation work that they were trying to do in order to build their property. So what do you say to things that where counties are already coming and saying, I'm pushing back, client is losing money, developer is losing money, and this hasn't even been implemented. And
Yeah, Dave, they might be doing that based on those pre-implementation compliance measures. And I don't know which this is Lane County.
correct.
Yeah. So I can't remember which pick'em they picked. But I think those of you that had experience with the pre-implementation compliance measures, so if you or your clients have already had projects that didn't go through, those could be examples to highlight in a comment, because you could say, hey, our county's already implementing what you're asking them to do long term, and here's the impacts we're already seeing on the ground. And you need to take that into account in factoring in sort of how bad this is for, these economic considerations that you're looking at. So I think, yeah, that's one thing I think you could do with that. In terms of how to solve that issue right now, I don't know. Because yeah, I think the counties are also just sort of waiting and seeing, a lot of them, nobody wants to do this. The county doesn't want to do it, but they've been told to, and I think some counties are just waiting to kind of see where this goes long term. But Brent, go ahead.
A couple things. First, kind of as a follow up to my first one, if there are defenses that it makes it to where you don't have to be part of the National Flood Protection Plan, that only works out if you are in the financial position to where you don't have to worry about getting a mortgage, which creates a disproportionate harm, which is also not allowed under our Constitution, to create harm people based off of their financial wherewithal.
Yeah.
So that would seem to be an area to attack it also. Also, with our land use laws in Oregon, the buildable lands inventory is going to get wiped out by this. And so every jurisdiction would have to immediately, if they're going to comply with state law, would have to immediately start a urban growth boundary expansion process to make up for the lands that are no longer qualified for the buildable lands inventory because they're not buildable.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's something we're hitting on in our organizational comment letter, but like for those of you in communities, like, talking about that from the community perspective and comments would be really helpful, and including not only, well, hey, our experience in this community with the land that we have available means this is going to force a UGB expansion, but also here's our experience with UGB expansions. Here's how difficult they are. And then because they have, they're assuming you can do a UGB expansion because it's part of Oregon law, but we all know that you really can't. It takes decades, right? So anything that can provide context to FEMA to have to take into account as they're racking up the economic costs and the impacts to people and property and our land use system, the more ammo we can bring there, and the more we can do that with a local perspective, if you have one, the better, because they're going to then have to respond to that somehow or another. Now, at the end of the day, we don't know what they do. We don't know if we can get them to change course, but they at least have to take it into account and respond to the comments. Pam.
Is there any pressure or influence that can be brought to bear at the federal level? I realize this is an Oregon lawsuit and an Oregon issue, but the current administration, doesn't seem to lean toward environmental protection and does seem to lean more toward the economy. And so this adverse impact on the Oregon economy that's happening as a result of the potential ruling by a federal agency, it seems like the federal government could apply some kind of influence. Is that avenue even a possibility?
Yeah, yeah, and and we hope that there's an opportunity for that. And I know we're working with NAR on trying to have conversations with the appropriate people about that. I know Congressman Bentz has been working diligently to try to have those conversations as well. And as I mentioned, with the lawsuit, we are in a settlement negotiation with this administration. Um, that's why the case has stayed. But the federal government is very large, and there's multiple agencies involved. And this, at this point, while it should be scary to everyone across the country, is currently an Oregon specific issue. And there has been a lot of changes in personnel at the federal level, including in some of these agencies. And so it's been slower than we had hoped to try to get any traction there. But we're hoping. But I will say this, if anyone is hoping that this isn't going to happen just because, President Trump has said he wants to abolish FEMA, so, this isn't likely to go forward. I just don't count on that, right? Like those things are so unpredictable, what's going to happen. And so far, FEMA and NIMS are in the same course they've always been on this, and they're charging forward, and nothing's changed in their position at this point. And so we just can't, please don't rely on that. And this comment period we have is it's a one-shot thing. This is our opportunity for public comment. We're trying the litigation route. We're trying the route of working through to talk to the administration, but we need to use all the routes we have available and not make any assumptions that anyone's going to be successful. We got to try all of them to try to get a change in course here. Any other questions, feedback, anything else we could do to be helpful to you to share this information and to make comments?
I guess I'm still looking for clarification on, I mean, we're saying that this is going to affect whether or not a property is insurable. But if these become city ordinances or, county ordinances, that sort of thing, it's not just going to not just going to have the effect on the insurance, but it will actually have an effect on the buildability of the property. Is that correct?
Yeah, correct. And based on what I went through, you can do your own assessment based on your experience on the ground in your community with development. Can developers really bear both the cost of what I described and also um, is there land available to do that mitigation on? Would it be like, so is this really feasible? Because when I look at this, what I see is that essentially, except for minor things, that's going to shut down development because these requirements are so onerous that they're not going to be able to be met.
Correct. And I know, I mean, our community directly, Eugene, Springfield, Lane County, I mean, we have some, some heavy development happening within that 170 feet right now or proposed, and that's going to have a profound effect on those public, public and private large scale development, but also just individual landowners building a home. I have a client right now that went under contract last week on a property in floodplain. And now I'm wondering if they need to, terminate based on the information at hand because they may not have the opportunity to develop the lot that they're wanting to purchase.
Yep. There's a question there about the DEQ stormwater permits. Yeah, great question. I mean, I don't know the answer. You're still going to have to get a stormwater permit. Depending on the design that you do of your development and how you mitigate, there could be some things that I guess are beneficial related to stormwater, others that are harmful. You're now going to have to do this mitigation activity on potentially a separate property. So is that going to require additional permits there too? I mean, I think there's a lot of unanswered questions. We are sending a letter this week with a whole bunch of groups, public, private, to the governor and to all legislators, asking them to weigh in more forcefully. And, I think all the state agencies that have their own permitting processes that are going to be impacted by this and create layers of complexity and may conflict with these requirements, it'd be very helpful if they were to also weigh in, because they're important players here and could help FEMA understand how some of these ideas may not actually intersect well with other permitting processes we have here in Oregon. Any more? Well, I'm dropping my email in the chat as well. Feel free to email me. Please use the website. I'm gonna drop another email in the chat, which is Michael, who's sort of the administrator for our coalition, and he can get back to you quickly and can get you materials and things that you might need. info@floodplainprotection.org is that email.
All righty.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you.
Thank you.